Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Sega was really known back in its arcade heyday for producing games with amazing graphics that sometimes seemed years ahead of what everyone else was doing. And there was a subset of their games that pretty much were just that. Games like Hang On, Space Harrier, Afterburner 2, and Galaxy Force 2 were known as Super Scalers and ran on powerful arcade hardware. The Super Scaler moniker comes from the fact that these games were powered by special hardware that allowed sprites, those moving objects on the screen that represented things like player characters, enemies, and bullets, to be resized within certain parameters at will. While it's trivial with today's computing power to create sprite scaling in real time via software alone, on the hardware of the mid-80s to mid-90s, that was impossible, at least at reasonable, playable game speeds. With some hardware dedicated to the task, which was expensive though, you could get incredible results. The arcade experience of the Super Scaler titles was amazing and something that no home system will be able to replicate faithfully until the 32-bit era came along. And even then, there were some titles that wouldn't see quote-unquote perfect home conversions until a generation or more later, even though most were pretty much right there in the Saturn and PlayStation era, with just a few exceptions. You might think that since there was no hope of producing faithful conversions of these games on the vastly less powerful home consoles of the 8 and 16-bit eras, that Sega must have failed at bringing any of them home in a decent form. If you think that, well, you're wrong! We saw direct home conversions or sequels to a lot of Sega's Super Scaler titles on a lot of platforms with varying degrees of success. For today's video, I'll be sticking to Sega's home hardware from the 16-bit era. So in this episode, I'll be taking a look at every Super Scaler game that Sega brought home to the Genesis/Mega Drive. Originally, I was also going to include the Sega Master System conversions in this video, but it just ended up being too long, so I cut those out, and I'll dedicate an entirely separate video to those at another time. I will throw in a few bonus games at the end that run on the Genesis, but aren't arcade conversions, yet try to achieve similar results. Join me on a short journey through years of Sega's pseudo 3D mayhem, and see how they did with each Super Scaler title that they brought home. I'll also give each game a simple rating to let you know how good a conversion it was, considering the hardware limitations of the Genesis on a scale of hit if it's good, miss if it's bad, and meh if it's in between. Let's get on with it. We begin with one of many classic titles that appear in this episode, Afterburner, or really more accurately, Afterburner 2. Let me explain the situation with Afterburner super quick. Sega released Afterburner in Japan in 1987, but it's almost definitely not the version that you played in arcades, since it was only released in Japan. A few months later, Sega released an updated version worldwide named Afterburner 2 that had more levels, modified some of the music by removing melodies primarily, added speed controls, and changed the way that missiles worked slightly. That's the version that we got in US arcades, and most of the world only ever saw that version in arcades. The only consoles that got a port of the first Afterburner were the Sega Master System and NES/Famicom. Well, technically, the Game Boy Advance did too, but many years later. But let's focus here. Drink in the awesomeness of Afterburner 2, which you now behold. The smooth 60 frames per second sprite scaling bliss made this one of the most amazing arcade games to experience upon its release and for years thereafter. Let's see how the Genesis version ended up, shall we? Sega released a version of Afterburner 2 for the Genesis in 1990, and this one was actually pretty damn impressive. Obviously, it's way toned down from the arcade release, since the Genesis/Mega Drive didn't have hardware sprite scaling like the arcade game, but it looks great, it plays great, and it sounds great. I think this was easily the best home port of Afterburner 2 until we got way more powerful hardware like the 32X, Saturn, and beyond. The smooth rotation of the horizon and excellent controls are what really make this one stand out against all other contemporary home versions. It even supported the weirdo analog controller thing that only came out in Japan. Still, the music and gameplay are really what elevate this Genesis version of Afterburner 2 to the top spot ahead of all its contemporary competition. I give Afterburner 2 on the Genesis the conversion score of hit. Hey, we're off to a pretty good start here. Okay, I've covered Galaxy Force 2 a lot on this channel. It's the pinnacle of Super Scalers and sprite scaling graphics, period, in my opinion. It looks pretty incredible even today, and it was downright jaw-dropping in 1988. I don't think there's any game that has used sprite scaling to create environments that's nearly as impressive. The gameplay was pretty good, with a good level of background interactivity, especially when you have to speed up and slow down while taking corners inside bases. Galaxy Force 2 is a bit on the short side with just a few levels, but it's kind of like an amusement park ride. It's just a thrilling experience from start to finish. I'll add, this is the Super Scaler game that I've personally come back to and replayed the most over the years. Also, this is the game I was talking about earlier that was not faithfully reproduced at home until the PlayStation 2 version came along. The best way to play it, however, is probably the awesome 3DS port, which I highly recommend. Anywho, Galaxy Force in the arcade faced a similar situation to Arcade Afterburner, in that there was a simpler version released first with fewer levels, and then a sequel which was really just the original game with a few extra levels and some bug fixes. So Galaxy Force 2 isn't exactly a direct sequel, it's more like a director's cut of the first game. Now, Galaxy Force 2 found its way onto the Genesis/Mega Drive in 1991 in Japan and 1992 in the US and other regions. The graphics are severely neutered, and of course, they had to be. The music, though, is well done and pretty close to the arcade release in many places. The gameplay has most of the features of the arcade version, it just loses the rotating horizon. So Sega used fairly simple color cycling techniques to represent walls, floors, and ceilings for the insides of the bases, but it ends up looking extremely primitive compared to the arcade original. While this game is okay, it isn't one of the better Super Scaler conversions to hit Sega's 16-bit home system. I'll award this one the not-so-coveted conversion score of meh, and it just barely gets that. Alrighty, here's G-LOC from 1990. This is another game I've shown in a few other videos, so we won't spend much time on it here. It was sort of a follow-up to Afterburner with vastly superior graphics in the arcade, but vastly inferior, well, everything else. It's slow and plodding compared to Afterburner, and it has just this unshakable feeling of utter dullness that sort of permeates every single facet of this game. Now, some of G-LOC is mighty impressive visually, but even this arcade original is so mundane when it comes to gameplay that I'd only recommend it to people that have trouble sleeping when nothing else has worked. The Genesis/Mega Drive received a relatively faithful conversion of G-LOC in 1993. There are some things that are fairly visually impressive in the Genesis version, like the transition from the cockpit view to behind the plane. You might also be surprised at some of the relatively impressive, almost Mode 7-esque style graphics that we find on the floors here. I guess Mode 7 is an SNES only thing, I'm just comparing it to that because it's a similar effect where we have a flat floor that looks like it's tilted toward the horizon. But G-LOC, despite all this, is still an inherently boring game, and there's no universe in which I'd rather play G-LOC than Afterburner 2. It's slower, blander, and just has way less going on in it. The music isn't any good at all either. So this one, as a Super Scaler conversion, I'll give it a meh, but as a game in general, it's a miss. OutRun is a game that needs no introduction. Oh, well, I guess since you're here, I should give it one anyway, huh? OutRun came out in 1986 and is one of the most beloved arcade driving games of all time. And that's right, I said driving instead of racing, because people get mad if you call OutRun a racing game for some reason. You know, even though you're constantly up against the clock and trying to finish a course before time runs out. Anywho, OutRun is awesome. It looks great, sounds great, and was always a lot of fun to play. It's easy to see why it's such a timeless classic. Of course, it found its way home to many consoles and computers. But the version we're going to look at today is the one for the Genesis. 5 years after the release of the arcade original, Sega brought the game home to the Genesis/Mega Drive. And I feel like Genesis OutRun is just a version of the game that gets way too much flack. For running on hardware with zero sprite scaling, this actually looks fairly close to the arcade original. Despite the much lower frame rate, the gameplay is still on point. The music is also pretty close to the arcade original, and it even has an extra song. So why does this version get so much hate? I think there are a few reasons. First off, in the early 90s, any home conversion or port of a game that had been out for at least a few years was usually labeled by magazine reviewers as an old game. Secondly, there's another version that people swear is better on the PC Engine, but it isn't. See my Sega arcade ports on Genesis versus PC Engine video for all the reasons why. Anyway, OutRun on the Genesis is a great conversion on limited hardware and was superior to every other home version prior to the 32-bit era. I happily give this one a rating of hit. Next up we have OutRunners, which hit the arcades in 1992 or 1993, depending on which source you trust more. This was the second sequel to OutRun following Turbo OutRun, which we'll see a little later. While this game looked dramatically better than OutRun in the arcade and had generally smoother gameplay, it just lacks the magic of the original. Sure, it's technically way more impressive, but it's also just not as appealing in any way. OutRunners was a game that I've tried to like and spend a lot of time with, but I just realized that, hey, I don't enjoy this one. If you like it, that's cool, but I think we can all at least acknowledge it definitely wasn't the classic that OutRun was. OutRunners made its way home to the Genesis, and well, it'll look like this. Yeah, if the arcade version was unappealing, this one is downright repulsive. OutRunners came to the Genesis/MD in late 1994, and Sega didn't even bother publishing this one themselves in the US because it was pretty clear they knew it wasn't good. This is another situation where no one in their right mind would have expected the Genesis version to look even remotely close to the arcade original. Yet even with expectations in check, this version disappointed pretty much everyone. It's very plain, it's dull, it's not much fun. The game is frankly kind of depressing. It's a miss as a conversion, and a miss as a game on its own merits.
Haha, you missed!
Space Harrier. It was released in 1985 and is one of my all-time favorite games. At the point of its release, there was no other game like it. The iconic checkerboard floor and super fast and smooth sprite scaling made this one really stand out in the arcades. Some people complain these days that it's just too simple a game. And yeah, it's a simple game, but sometimes that's okay. We have to keep in mind when these games were released and what the market was like back then, and what the competition was like back then. The arcades weren't exactly filled with games that had deep gameplay. There were things you were supposed to play for 5 to 15 minutes, and Space Harrier was a glorious way to spend 15 or so minutes. Now, Sega did not release a version of Space Harrier for the Genesis, at least not initially. Genesis got Space Harrier 2. This was a super early game for the system, and many were disappointed that it still had choppy, jerky graphics and didn't really do anything all that different from the original Space Harrier. Now, it was an okay game that really should have been better, but anyone who could get over the admittedly choppy player and enemy movements would find this game was actually pretty good, and that the startlingly smooth checkerboard floor looked awesome and seemed to portend great things for future Genesis games. Ah well, not everything is as it seems. There were never any super smooth Super Scaler conversions. The closest we got to that was probably Afterburner 2. One note, I'm not including the versions of Space Harrier 1 and 2 that are on the Genesis Mini 2, since they only exist on theoretical hardware and came out in 2022. They were built by M2, a lot of 2s in this one, emulating a scaling chip that might have been feasible to add to the Genesis back in the day. Oh, and if you don't know the story, the Genesis was originally supposed to have a sprite scaling chip. It was designed with one, but they removed it before the hardware was finalized to reduce costs. Anyway, as a conversion, or in this case imitation of a Super Scaler game, while I like Space Harrier 2, I have to give it a meh. It's just too choppy to rate it higher than that.
Meh.
Super Hang-On, released in 1987, was the sequel to Sega's big hit, Hang-On. Visually, it was just kind of a minor upgrade from the original, but the gameplay and especially the music were way better this time around. Super Hang-On added the Nitro button for a long sustained speed boost that would allow you to really zoom past the competition. And while I don't have any empirical evidence for this, I'm going to tell you that I think Super Hang-On is probably still regarded as most people's favorite motorcycle racing game on Sega arcade hardware. It may not generate the reverence of something like OutRun, but this game is definitely fondly remembered today. Super Hang-On was ported to many computers and also ended up as a very early Sega Genesis title. The Genesis release is pretty nice. It's not as smooth as the arcade version, but other than that, it looks pretty sharp and was very well done, especially for an early title. It's a tad slow, but the graphics, sound, and gameplay all translated pretty well to Sega's, at the time, fledgling 16-bit console. This version also added a bunch of stuff not present in the arcade game, and was one of the first to really set a precedent for making meteor home releases of arcade titles. A precedent that unfortunately Sega did not often follow. Oh well, this was a good game, and while it is a bit on the slow side, I am still going to score this conversion as a hit. Here's Super Monaco GP. This was another game that ran on Sega's X-board and it looked really impressive in the arcade. As a game, I found it decent, but it was never one of my favorites. But hey, if you were an F1 fan, this was the most advanced F1 racing game you could play in an arcade in 1989. And no matter what, it's still easy to appreciate the technical prowess on display here, with the fairly detailed track sides and even the rear view mirror at the top of the screen. Arcade Super Monaco GP is good, but not a great game, I would say. Now, Sega brought out a version of Super Monaco GP to the Genesis in 1990. Visually, it's of course way scaled down compared to the arcade game. The gameplay was alright in the Genesis version, but not anything particularly special. Like Super Hang-On, it did add career mode elements to make it a much more compelling package than the arcade original. Now I have to say, I was shocked back in the day when this game got sky-high reviews in EGM, including one of its earliest perfect 10s from one of their reviewers. I always found Super Monaco GP on Genesis a little dull and dreary, and I don't think it ever deserved anywhere near the level of praise that it got. In the end, this game is so-so and middling at best when compared to the arcade original. I'll give it a conversion score and game score of meh. Okay folks, here's Thunderblade. Probably the single most impressive game on the export, and that's saying something. Thunderblade looked crazy good. We had so many different perspectives and just things that looked three-dimensional in ways that they didn't on other games. We had buildings and scenery that could be seen from different heights and viewing angles, and just stuff that was kind of revolutionary at the time. Thunderblade just looked absolutely incredible, and it played pretty well too. Also, they totally ripped off the title screen from Blue Thunder, a movie from 1983 that was preceded by a little-known TV series that only ran for 11 episodes in 1984 that I actually watched on TV as a kid when it was new because I'm old. Blue Thunder the TV series is notable for having Dana Carvey, Bubba Smith, and Dick Butkus all as series regulars. Anywho, back to gaming here. Sega released a game they called Super Thunderblade on the Genesis, but really, it was just Thunderblade minus its primary level intro overhead scenes. Super Thunderblade is not good. It's slow, it's ugly, it's choppy. It was another of the earliest titles to appear on the Genesis, and it kinda shows. I don't know why Sega focused so hard on titles like this and Space Harrier 2 after making the decision to remove sprite scaling from the system, which is a duo of mistakes if you ask me. The music is kind of okay, I guess, but other than that, there are few redeeming qualities to Super Thunderblade. It's just a bad version of the game. This one is a miss.
Haha, you missed!
Here's our final Super Scaler conversion today, Turbo OutRun. This was the first arcade sequel to OutRun. It was released in 1989, and they kind of went the Super Hang-On route by adding a sustained turbo boost feature. Now, Turbo OutRun wasn't super well received back in the day, and today, I doubt you can find a single gamer that will say this is a better game than the original OutRun. It's more complicated than the original in some ways, and even simpler in others. But overall, it's kind of visually unappealing, it's less fun to play, and it's just pretty much a miss on every level as a game. It's not terrible, it's just alright, but pales compared to the original. Now, Turbo OutRun was not released for the Genesis in the US. Again, Sega had the good sense not to put out this stinker of a game here. It did release in Japan and Europe, unfortunately. While the original OutRun on Genesis was on an 8 megabit cartridge, Turbo OutRun, a larger game with more stuff in it, was actually on a measly 4 megabit cartridge. Now you may find people saying online that Tiertex developed this game on the Mega Drive, but don't believe that. They handled the computer ports, which were mostly based on the Mega Drive version, which was done by CRI, who did most of the other Super Scaler ports for the Genesis and Japanese computers. Anyway, Genesis Turbo OutRun is bad. You shouldn't play it unless you want to bask in its crapulence. This one, as you may have guessed, is a miss.
Haha, you missed!
But I don't want to end things today on a sour note. Let's take a look at 3 other games that aren't arcade ports but are similar to Super Scaler games from Sega. Here's OutRun 2019. This futuristic racing game, which bears little in common with OutRun, is a pretty decent game and it's got some impressive visual effects throughout. It won't blow you away or anything, but it's a well done game and it's fun to play. The roadsides are a bit bare as to be expected, but some of the road effects you'll see in this one will probably surprise you. And strangely enough, this game originally started life as a Sega CD title called Cyber Road. This is notable since the Sega CD had hardware scaling capabilities, and this game would have probably been mighty impressive on the Sega CD. After it got picked up to the Genesis and they got the OutRun license for it, we ended up with this game, which is still decent and worth a look if you've never played it. This is the first Road Rash from Electronic Arts. EA's Road Rash started life on the Genesis, and overall it's pretty impressive. It's not the smoothest game in the world, but it had lots of nice road effects and a decent amount of roadside objects and racers on screen. It's also a smidge slow for a racing game, but this game and its first sequel on the Genesis are pretty impressive, and at least a little reminiscent of Sega's own Super Scaler games. These days, it feels like more people talk about the 32-bit version that's found on 3DO, PlayStation, and Saturn. But the Genesis is where Road Rash got its start, and the Genesis still has the best version of the original Road Rash. If you've never checked it out before, hey, go ahead and give it a look. Lastly, this is Panorama Cotton from Sunsoft and Success. You may know the 2D Cotton titles, which were horizontal shooters. Panorama Cotton switches to a chase view and is probably the most impressive Super Scaler-like game to appear on the Genesis/Mega Drive. This was a later release for the system, having come out in 1994, and unfortunately it was only released in Japan. Still, there are lots of pretty fancy effects in this one, and it looks great. Only let down a smidge by a frame rate that is a tad low for a game of this type. Everything else is spot on though. If you've never tried this one out, go ahead and do that. You'll probably be quite surprised. Alrighty folks, so there you go. Every Super Scaler arcade game that was either converted to the Genesis/Mega Drive, or the few cases where a direct sequel appeared to sort of take the place of the original. The results were quite mixed, as you've seen. Now overall, I think a lot of these games could have at least been a little better. And I know it was a gigantic and difficult task to try and convert games that relied on specialized hardware to other hardware that didn't have those chips. But despite that, we had some that were really well done, like Afterburner 2 and OutRun. And you have to wonder, well, why weren't the other ones a little bit better? Especially things like OutRunners that came along quite a bit later. And yeah, it's easy to excuse at least, very, very early games, like Super Thunderblade and Space Harrier 2. Developers were still coming to grips with the system at that point. I would really love to see some homebrew takes on what could be done with simulated sprite scaling on the Genesis these days. Anyway, tell me what you think. What are some of your favorite scaling style games on the Genesis? Do you prefer some of the ones I didn't show here, like say the Lotus titles or Top Gear, or some of the many others that are done in that same sort of visual style? Go ahead and tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.